Well, a very good evening. Warm welcome to visitors. Welcome back, alumni. I see many distinguished alumni here in the audience. For those who don't know me, my name's Andrew Lickham and I'm the Dean of London Business School. As an organisation, we pride ourselves on being original. And this occasion is original, indeed unique in the history of the London Business School, as far as I can see, in a number of ways. The first one, I think, is that if you look at the subject matter here, this is new territory for us as a school. We're used to the idea of looking at people as individuals, and we're looking at organisations. But I think this is the first time we've taken society and organisations and individuals in the same work. I just have to say this is a difficult thing to do, and I'm so pleased that the authors have actually taken on this really difficult task in spanning the whole spectrum in that way. Second thing is that it's a combination of two distinguished faculty members. I am very proud of the fact the school has brought these two together to think about these issues in this way for the benefit of the rest of us, and also that they are distinguished faculty. The competition for the word distinguished here is pretty fierce, I can tell you. So I use the word quite carefully, but it's true. And I'm very, very pleased too that by coming together, they brought two very different viewpoints together, two viewpoints that are very rarely brought together in this way. And they not only had enthusiasm for the idea of the book, but here we are, and it's all finished. And I'm delighted that I was there at the very beginning when they were thinking originally about, well, should we do something like this? I won't say anything more because you want to hear about the book itself. To introduce them, I'm delighted also that our moderator this evening is Lynda Yueh. For those who don't know her, she's an adjunct professor of economics here and also a fellow and lecturer at St Edmund Hall, Oxford. Many of you will know her, of course, in her work as presenter and commentator for the BBC. Lynda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. This is actually a most confusing event. There are two Andrews and two Lyndas with you this evening. But just to be clear, all the hard questions go to that Lynda and that Andrew, who I'm going to introduce in just a moment. It's just my absolute pleasure to be here. As Andrew just said, this is such a unique pairing of two superb academics from psychology, from economics, to look at a question that I just find intrinsically interesting for whatever walk of life you're in. So we're used to a three-stage life where you get an education, we work, we retire. But what if we're alive in 100 years, in the year 2100? What does that mean for rethinking not just work, but our lives? And I can't think of two better people to lead us through this thought process than Lynda and Andrew. So let me just, many of you already know them, but let me just give very quick introductions to the two of them. Lynda Gratton is professor of management practice. She directs the human resource strategy in transforming companies, which is considered to be the world's leading program on human resources. She's a frequent speaker at Davos, and some of you may have caught this on YouTube at Davos from earlier this year, where she spoke on this subject, what if you're alive in 2100? And the poll that they conducted found that most of the participants thought that a 100-year life means you will have more marriages and divorces. But we are clearly going to go beyond that. And her co-author is Andrew Scott, professor of economics here and a fellow of All-Souls College at Oxford University. He has been an advisor to companies, to governments, to the Treasury, Bank of England. He's a non-executive director of the Financial Services Authority. But here is the position that I most envy Andrew, and I envy Andrew on lots of things. He has been economic advisor to the Prime Minister of Mauritius. But both are just superb. They're both top-notch researchers and teachers. Both have won teaching prizes, and to me, they exemplify the best of LBS. So I'm pleased to introduce them. They'll each in turn give half the presentation. And afterwards, I'll have a chance to conduct a little bit of a conversation with them. And then there'll be a chance for you to pose questions from the audience before we all adjourn to some lovely canapes and drinks. So without further ado, let me invite up Andrew.
Well, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming along, and thank you, Lynda and Andrew, for those kind words. If we do have a 100-year life, I very much hope that one way we'll use that time is to give us a lot longer to do this presentation. We have a great deal to get through in the next half an hour. This is sort of really big picture stuff, and both Lynda and I have spent a lot of time trying to think about what the future might be in different ways. And then we stumbled upon this topic, which is so multi-stranded and so interconnected. And it's great fun being an academic. We do tend to focus as academics upon coming up with very specific answers. I hope what this is really about is about asking big questions and getting you as individuals and firms, as organizations, and society as a whole to start thinking, well, what do we do with this longevity? So that's very much the spirit of this book, and I hope you're engaged in it tonight in that way. So let's start off with the brutal stats. I'm a stats guy. I'm going to hit you with some numbers. Not my numbers. These are some demographic projections. My goodness, we could talk for a long while about what the demographic debate is around. There are many different views. I thought economists disagreed amongst themselves a lot. Demographers really, really fight amongst themselves. You'd almost think it was a subject of life and death. But anyway, there are very big differences of opinion. And some people are pessimistic, some are incredibly optimistic. This is taken from the work of a very high-profile, very well-known, very respected academic who says basically that because of the last 200 years, every decade we've seen an increase in life expectancy of 2 or 3 years. In other words, every generation lives 6 to 9 years longer than their parents. And as a consequence of that, he predicts that 50% of the children born in 2007 are expected to live to that age or beyond. Sadly, you're all a bit too young for that to apply to you, but every 10 years you're off, make an adjustment, and that's what this next chart is. It basically says, I won't ask you when you were born, but think about your birth year, and this gives you an indication of what that statistic implies to you. 50% of the babies born in 1967, that's closest to me, will live to 91 or beyond. And our point is that we need to adapt to this. We still have the life designed for 70 years, and it can't very well stretch out to cover 90 or even 100 years. So this is the key question. If we are living for longer, and of course not everyone in society is living for longer, 50% of children there we were talking about, not everyone, but if we are living for longer, what are we going to do with this time? And it is an extraordinary increase in time. We do some calculations about sort of productive hours you're going to have. You live to 70, you have 125,000 hours. You live to 80, you have 156,000. Live to 100, and it's 220. Nearly double what you have age 70. And this is kind of what we think is good news. We all want more time. And suddenly we have almost another 100,000 hours compared to 70 years and 10. So what are you and what is society going to do with that time? Malcolm Gladwell claims it takes 10,000 hours to become an expert. It's much disputed, but my goodness, think of the new expertise and skills you could acquire in that time. So we think this is a positive thing, but I've got to give you some bad news, which you probably worked out, actually. One thing you're going to be doing with that time is working for longer, all right? And I'm going to go through very quickly some painful maths, and this is kind of the tough love, all right? Because there is an inescapable mathematical logic. If you live for longer, you either have to work for more, or save for more, or spend less, all right? The choice is up to you which of those three you do, but if we focus on sort of average savings behavior of people, the result is most people are going to live for longer. So in the book, we have the joy of just creating, it's a very sort of fun book. We create 3 characters, and you're going to meet each of these characters. The first is Jack. Jack is born in 1945. Got some bad news about Jack because he has a life expectancy of 70. So he actually passes away in 2015, okay? Now we see Jack as stereotypical of a 3-stage life that works very well over 70 years. And to show you that, here are some finances. We're just looking at the finances for later. For later, we'll broaden this out. Now, what we try and do with all these characters is try and work out how much they need to save if they want to retire on a pension that is 50% of their final income. Big debate in the book, is 50% enough, should you have more, etc. But 50% is not wildly ambitious, it's plausible for above average earners. So we're looking at how much you need to save every year. We look at historical rates of return, calibrate on the Dimson-Marsh data set of the last 100 years, make standard assumptions about portfolios. But Jack is going to work for 42 years, he retires at 62, and he passes away at 70. So 42 years of work and 8 years of retirement. A 5-to-1 ratio really helps Jack. The other thing that really helps Jack is he gets a company pension scheme. So he gets a company pension scheme that pays him a pension worth about 20% of final salary. Now, you'd be aware those are disappearing rapidly. The faculty in the room will know they're disappearing rapidly, as will the stories about steel and British home stores. We know that these are under challenge. So Jack benefits from a company pension scheme. He gets something from the state that's equivalent to 10% of his final salary, and he has to save the rest himself. But all he has to do is save 4% every single year, and that delivers a pension worth 50% of his final salary. And that's a very possible, plausible number. 5-10% is mildly ambitious for a lot of people, but it's kind of done by about 25% of people with above average earnings. The other character we're going to talk about is Jimmy. Jimmy is born in 1971. He has life expectancy of 85. So Jimmy's, I'll come back to that in a second. Jimmy is going to have to work for 44 years. He's going to retire at 65. He starts work at 21. And he's got 20 years of retirement to finance. So straight away, there's a 2-to-1 ratio now of work and retirement, not 5-to-1. The company pension scheme's disappeared, so he's got to fund twice as much as Jack, and he's got to fund it for 2 or 3 times longer. So the result is that Jimmy needs to save 17% of his income every single year. And that's a big jump from the 4% we saw for Jack, and that's a demanding number for most people. So Jimmy is kind of waking up to the idea that he's not going to be able to retire at 65. He's going to have to carry on working into his early 70s. And that's exactly what we see happening in the data. This is US data of percentage of the population aged over 65 who are still at work. If I took it back to 1920, 1930, you'd see this massive historical decline as a pension and a retirement became a social norm. And what we've been seeing the last 20 years is a trend rebound, and I suspect that trend's going to carry on increasing very sharply. That 3-stage life of education, work, and retirement, what Jack is having to do is stretch that second stage, make that second stage longer. And that's a problem, because if we look at measures of welfare over time, you get a very interesting result. These are taken from the UK, the Office of National Statistics, and the life satisfaction is on the left-hand side. And what you can see is that when you're 16 to 19, you're very happy. As you get older, you get less happy. The worst years are kind of Jimmy's age right now, where he's balancing work and family. And then as you retire, you get happier. So Jimmy is having to respond to this problem of longevity by extending that second stage, extending the part of life that is least happy because it's too much focused on work and money and not enough focused on the things that are most valuable in life. And a quietness descends upon the room. Then there's Jane, a character we invent. She's born in 1998, and she's got life expectancy of 100. This is kind of my kids. This is a different world entirely. She's looking at a very, very long-term horizon. We're going to come on to this later, but one of the interesting things you find is that people are committing later in life, whether it be to buying a house, having a child, getting married, a career, etc. Sort of people aren't committing so early, although that's perhaps what my father would say. They're not committing early. Now, one of the things we argue is that, of course, the longer life is, the more important options are. Those of you who've done your finance courses at LBS will know that the value of an option depends upon the underlying uncertainty and the length of time over which the option holds. Extend life, options become more valuable. And so what we're seeing is whole new stages of life being created. And I think if you wander around and look at what my 20-year-old children are doing, or look at what's happening in Shoreditch, etc., you're seeing a new stage of life being created, which is not so much based around acquiring assets and committing to work and other things, but exploring. Some of that is forced upon them by student debt, high house prices, and a tough economy, but others we think is about this value of options. So we think there's something happening with Jane, and you can see why, because if you do the calculations for Jane of how much she has to save, if she wants to retire at 65 and she's going to live to 100, it's ridiculous. Okay? So we calculate that Jane's probably going to have to work till late 70s or early 80s. So we didn't know whether to call the book a 60-year career or a 100-year life. Which do you think is more appealing as a title? So Jane kind of knows she's got this long, long working career right ahead of her. She's going to be doing things differently. We found this great survey that Manpower did recently. They were asking millennials, when do you expect to retire? And as you can see, 12% of millennials think they're going to work until they die. This was really a big response in Japan, so I think kind of something needs to be done urgently in Japan, because that's a very depressing thought. But you can see that Jane's generation think they're going to work later than previous generations, but I still think they're probably underestimating how long they're going to have to work for. So it's interesting when we sort of do this conversation with people, because we think you should be excited that life is longer, but this doesn't sound very exciting. Okay? This stretching out of this second stage is not very appealing. So we think that the three-stage life can't withstand this longevity. Basically, time is structured in a way that society thinks is best, given technology and preferences and longevity. And we've structured a 70-year life, a three-stage life, around 70 years. But if we're living for longer, and on average we're healthier for longer, if you look at these years of life expectancy, most of the extra years of life expectancy on average are coming through as healthy years of life expectancy. So we are fitter for longer. The example I always give here is the Rolling Stones, who have an average age of 72. I think of my grandparents at age, the Rolling Stones are much more able and fit than my grandparents were at 72. So the arc of aging is being stretched. We are, in essence, younger for longer, but we're going to have to redesign life. What tends to happen is we sort of base our life expectancy on what our parents had, but if every generation is living 6 to 9 years longer than the past, that's going to be an underestimate. And of course, the role models of society are based on an earlier longevity. And if you think about Jack, Jimmy, and Jane, our story is that Jane is kind of implicitly aware of this. She's aware that she's running a 1,500-meter race, not a 10,000-meter race. And so she's setting different milestones and doing different things. Jimmy, the sort of mid-40s, he's been running a race that's a 10,000-meter race. He sort of reached the 7,000-meter mark, and has been told, actually, you've got to carry on to 15,000 meters. And, what do? You can't just carry on doing the same as you've been doing, because that's not a good life. You have to change and try and do things differently. So we believe the three-stage life is already coming under a lot of stress, a lot of fracture. You can see it with Jimmy, and you can certainly see it with Jane. And to explain more exactly why a three-stage life is coming under stress, I'm going to hand over to Lynda.
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks. Thank you. So, one of the things that people have said to us about the book, because but the book actually launched last night, and we've had quite a lot of press, actually, and quite a lot of interviews, and everyone says, well, it's incredibly positive, isn't it? Why would you be so positive about this? But we think there are enormous positive outcomes when life extends, but to make it really positive, you have to start thinking really carefully about the life you want to live. And indeed, you have to think really carefully about your choices. And in a sense, one of the real important issues about what happens when the three-stage life breaks is it means that each one of us is sort of on our own. Because the marvelous thing about the three-stage life is everybody did it at the same time. So we could all predict what we were going to do. But now it's breaking. Each one of us, each one of our children has got to start making decisions. And that's why we think this is such an important book, actually, and such an important topic. we are an economist and a psychologist, and so perhaps you shouldn't be surprised that we first of all use the word assets, which is not really a word that psychologists use, and then we talk about tangible and intangible assets. And I think that one of the contributions that Andrew and I have made is to begin to describe what we mean by tangible and intangible assets. Now, my suspicion is that this is just the beginning of a description. I don't think this is the final description, and I think other people will pick it up. But here's where we stand. What we say is that once life becomes different for each one of us, then we have to think really carefully about our assets. And we have to think about whether we're developing our assets, we're building them, whether we're maintaining them, or whether that we're depleting them. And that's, by the way, is why if you go to our website, www.100yearlife.com, you'll see that there is a diagnostic which helps you to decide, in terms of your assets, whether indeed you are building them, whether you're maintaining them, or whether you're depleting them. And we feel that when you're trying to get some big ideas across, as we are, a book is part of it, but we also think a website and diagnostics are also a really important part. So actually, we've put a huge amount of effort into building a website, and you'll see that it's already very interactional, and people are already coming in and posting their stories and doing the diagnostics and so on. Okay, here's our thinking. Andrew's already talked about tangible assets, so he's talked about savings, property, and pension. But what about intangibles? Now, if you look at Jack's life, or even Jimmy's life, he always knew that his intangible assets were about how productive he could be. And by that, we mean, the sort of skills that you have, how valuable your skills are, how your social capital in terms, particularly of your professional social capital, all of these we know to be really important. And indeed, there is a growing awareness that vitality is also an asset that each one of us can develop, build, maintain, deplete. What do we mean by vitality? Well, we mean obviously health, our understanding of health, our own personal health, but also we know that vitality comes from the sort of friendships that we have. And we know that people who live happy, productive, long lives tend to have rejuvenating friendships. They tend to have these marvelous, friends that are with them, that support them. And this is a pretty well understood research finding, actually, in terms of people living long lives. But we've added one other asset, and it's the asset of transformation. Why is it important? Well, if you say that the three-stage life is dead, then clearly you're moving towards a multi-stage life. And if you think about Jack, he only had a couple of transitions, didn't he? He moved from full-time education to full-time work, and then he moved from full-time work to full-time retirement. And more importantly, Jack did that with everybody else in his age cohort. They all left university or college at the same time. They all went into a company at the same time. They all retired at the same time. So actually, Jack didn't really need to think about himself. He just had to follow everybody else in the herd. Now, what happens with a multi-stage life? And we found this with our MBA students. So we've been sort of practicing all of this stuff with our MBA students for the last year, and indeed our executives on some of our executive programs. And one of the things we've asked them to do is to write a multi-stage life for themselves. We've asked them to say, you live to 100, tell us how you're going to live. And they've written it all down, and I actually set it as an exam, which is even better. So they had to do it really well. And I could read 100 of them. And what came out is that they were all different. So it's very clear that they're going to be making transitions on their own, not with a great big herd around them. And that means that they have to build transformational assets. And we're very fortunate to have Hermine Ibarra here at London Business School, and that's really what she's researched. Her book on working identity, it really helps us understand how do people transform themselves. Well, they transform themselves in part because they understand themselves, and they transform themselves in part, again, social capital, that they've got diverse networks. Why because if your networks are homogeneous, then it's very difficult for you to change because all your relationships want you to stay the same. So diverse networks are very important because they provide a diversity of role models. And when people transform themselves into something different, they often do it because way in their diverse networks of people who are different from themselves, they catch a glimpse of what they could be, and they walk towards it. So this we believe to be a really important asset. And here they are. Something about your productivity, and you can see reputation is really important, as indeed is your peer group, mentoring and coaching, vitality, health, and particularly balanced living. I've been researching for some years now the questions of work and home and how people balance that. And you'll see in the book that we've devoted, not a considerable, but certainly a sort of significant piece to this issue of work, home, and how people create some sort of balance between the various parts of their lives. And also this question of regenerative relationships. We had our book launch last night. Some of you were there. It's wonderful to see you. At the publishers. And I had my friend Shirley. And my friend Shirley and I celebrated last year, 50 years of friendship. Now, one of the things that I say to my MBA class is, if you're my age, I'm 61, and you are a billionaire, which of course I'm not, I'm a professor at London Business School, far from being a billionaire, and you had, but all the money in the world, you couldn't buy a 50-year friendship. That is the essence of intangible assets. It's what money can't buy, but also it's about the choices you make. Because if you want a house in Primrose Hill, you can just go and buy it right now. But if you want a 50-year friendship, you have to invest in it 50 years ago. And that's really important because what that means is that people do have to make choices about what they do in a way that perhaps they didn't in the past. So this is going to be really important. And here's the transformational asset that we've sort of added and talked to quite a lot about in the book, which is you need to learn how to change yourself. If you're going to have a multi-stage life where you do many different things, you have to learn how to recast your identity as you move through your life. So what might that be? Well, one of the things that we did in the book with our marvelous characters, Jack, Jimmy, and Jane, was that we built scenarios for them. So we said, how could they possibly make this work? And of course, it's not really straightforward, particularly actually for Jimmy. Because the thing about Jane is she sort of knows already that she's going to have to change the way she lives compared to Jack. But Jimmy has sort of been caught mid-life. And that's, we know, is really, really difficult. And that's one of the reasons, as Andrew showed you, you're getting a real dip in life satisfaction with people in their mid-40s, because Jimmys are thinking, shit. I was teaching at one of our executive classes a few weeks ago, and somebody said, I'm going to have a T-shirt made saying, Je suis Jimmy. So what could he do? Well, look, here's a number of scenarios for Jimmy. One is we call the 3.0, which is the three stages, where he says, he goes, la, 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 la. And there will be quite a lot of people doing that, saying, oh, this isn't going to happen. Of course, this is not, Andrew's wrong. He's got all his calculations wrong. You won't have to work till you're 75. We're already getting that, by the way. We're already getting pushback on that. So some people will just say, this is not going to happen. I can carry on just as I am, and it'll be just like Jack. I can retire at 65. And of course, governments in some countries, I'm not naming any right now, are encouraging that view, saying it's fine, you'll be able to retire at 65. Now, the marvel about being a professor here at London Business School is we have tenure. So actually, we don't have to be re-elected, because nobody is going to be re-elected on what we're saying in this book. And that's why actually when we were talking to the government a few weeks ago about this, they're pretty pleased about the book, because we're going to take a lot of flack. And the government will say, oh yeah, of course, we probably have to and we probably do have to think a bit more about this. But actually, you can't retire at 65, even if you're in France. So what else could you do? Well, look, I mean, you can start shifting, and you can start already thinking about new ways of living, or you could reinvest and reinvigorate. And actually, what we show in the book is to do that. Jimmy has also got to think about his total life. He probably has to renegotiate his relationships with his wife. He has to think about what he's doing at work. He has to consider how he upgrades himself, how he actually reinvests in his asset class, particularly productivity and probably also vitality. But as we've already heard from Andrew, there's an idea that actually Jimmy could be somebody who holds on to his youth, who holds on to changing, who holds on to that marvelous adolescent phenomena of transforming yourself and all, understanding the choices that you face. What about Jane? Well, in a funny way, Jane is slightly easier than Jimmy because she sort of already knows it. And if she doesn't already know it, she's certainly going to hear about it in the next couple of years. I know that a lot of the discourse has been around the impact of technology on work and lives, but actually I think the next wave of discourse will be about this. It's just such a huge issue, and it's so important that we understand it. What are Jane's scenarios? Well, first of all, she's going to live longer. Secondly, she isn't going to live her life in lockstep with others. We know that. She's going to build her own life, and it will be it'll be beyond the herd, really. And actually, I was talking to one of my colleagues this morning who's 28 years old, and she said, that's a really big issue for us because we're beginning to realize that each one of us is doing things differently, and we're talking a lot about how are we doing it. So you're going to see, not just actually with Jane, but in fact with every one of our characters, a lot of experimentation because they don't know how to do this. And there aren't that many role models. So that's one of the things we feel is very positive. And you'll find people finding new ways of being productive. And also in a time, and I've written a lot about this, my book, The Shift, was really about that, about job destruction, shocks and tipping points. And we haven't devoted too much in the book about that. But of course, in parallel to Jane living 100 years, you are getting an unbelievably complex labour market, which she and everybody else is having to navigate around. So we expect multi-stage lives, and each one of us at any point in time will have to narrate what our possible selves are. And we've been doing that at London Business School with our students. We hope others will do it. That's why we built the website. That's why we built the diagnostic. You have to start narrating to yourself what your possible lives could be. And certainly we expect new stages to emerge. The 3 stages we have right now are full-time education, full-time work, full-time retirement. What might those be? Well, here's some ideas. I mean, obviously, others may emerge, but here's 4 ideas. Number 1, you know that your children, and certainly my kids, did the gap year, where they went and explored themselves, their options, their choices. We think that process of exploration will come back at different stages in somebody's lives, where they basically pull out and think about, what are my options? What are my choices? How do I reinvigorate? Secondly, the great promise of technological platforms, is you can be an independent producer. You can actually build a small business with relatively small numbers of people and you can make a living doing that. Of course, governments love this because it takes the emphasis away from large corporations. We see more people doing that at different stages in their lives. You could build a portfolio. Charles Handy, a great part of the London Business School, has talked about portfolios, but he saw it primarily in your 60s. Why couldn't you do that at any stage? And of course, there's also transitions. What's really interesting is when these stages become age agnostic, you get different ages doing the same thing. And those of you who are worried about stereotyping around age, and anyone who's getting older will be very worried about that once you start experiencing it yourself, what we know is that stereotypes break down when people who are different actually spend time with each other. So the marvelous thing about multi-stages is 70-year-olds are doing the same thing as 20-year-olds. And segmentation, age segmentation, has been a massive driver of stereotyping in our society. So this is what we think is important. So here's what makes Jane different. More transitions, her leisure time more used for investment than consumption, really interesting issues about her identity, her household relationships. We've got a whole chapter on relationships. Read the chapter. But clearly, there's a whole lot happening around that and how you negotiate. And when we asked our MBA students to build a life for themselves, you could see some said, I'm going to spend ages to find the right person, and then I'm going to stay with them until I'm 100. Some people said, I'm going to have 4 different relationships at these stages, and this is who it's going to be. Who knows? We don't know. But certainly that's all up for grabs. And it means that, and this is a big issue for corporations, people are not going to be doing the same thing at the same time. And those of you who know much about HR know HR practices love that. They love the fact that everyone's doing the same thing at the same time. It makes life a lot easier. So obviously, there's going to be a whole implication for corporations. We talk a lot about that in the book, and indeed, big implications for governments. So let me just summarize by saying that the 100-year life is going to create extraordinary opportunities. There's no doubt there'll be some battlefields, but we're delighted that we wrote the book, and we're delighted that London Business School has supported us in doing so. Thank you.
Fantastic presentations. I wonder how many of you shared my reaction to it, which was, first, you see that expectation of life expectancy, and you think, hooray, I'm going to live longer. And then you think, oh no, I got to work longer. So I suppose, first question on this I'm going to pose to Lynda, which is, you've talked about making individuals prepared,
Yeah.
and obviously I need to make myself a bit more prepared. Are corporations prepared?
No, not at all. Some of my research is done through my Future of Work consortium that has about 50 or 60 multinationals involved. So we did a whole piece of research with them last year. Not even vaguely prepared. It is going to be a battlefield. Yeah. I can't wait. Bring it on.
Andrew, is everyone going to live longer?
First of all, it's not up to me, Lynda. So if it was, the answer would be yes. But no, they're not. And this is a really complicated. I mean, first of all, the debate is very complicated. But one thing we do know is there's lots of individual specific factors into your life expectancy, and some of those are obvious, like gender. So the numbers I put up with that ladder. If you're a female, add 2 years. If you're a man, take away 1 year. So straight away, you've got those sort of differences. But there are really mixed trends here. And the very worrying thing in the US is white males aged, I think, 30 to 45, or perhaps 45, 54, are actually seeing really sharp increases in mortality. And the main cause of death in that group is suicide and opiate addiction. So there are really bad inequalities. We quote some in the book, but basically the difference between being in the top 10% of the income distribution and the bottom 10% is somewhere between 10 and 15 years. And obviously wealth inequality and income quality is of huge concern right now, but I think that life inequality is just outrageous. And you and I were talking beforehand, if someone's rich, you can take money from the rich and give it to the poor, but you can't take years of life from the rich and give it to the poor.
No, this is
and I think this is a really, really big issue. So the dimensions are enormous, but there is a big inequality issue here.
Yeah.
Wasn't there a movie with Justin Timberlake where the rich took life years from the poor?
Is that right?
Wow.
Well, this book is
My
a very
taste in
far.
movies.
This is a very far-ranging book. We've read an awful lot, but not yet the Justin Timberlake movie.
Yeah.
But that'll be later on.
You probably got the actor
tonight.
wrong, but
We can tweet it this evening, can't we?
but Lynda, I saw you agreeing there in terms of the issues of inequality this actually
Well,
raises.
actually, I mean, I heard Andrew say this for the first time today. We were speaking to a journalist, and he said the point: you can distribute money, but you can't distribute years. And I just said, God, that is such an important point, because it does mean that the policies around bridging that gap are a lot more complex than simply taxation. And that we're going to think, we've said something about in the book about it, but that's one of the things that we're continuing to write about.
And are there any downside risks that you would highlight from the 100-year life? Lynda first.
Well, there's masses of downside risks. I mean, the most obvious one is you don't sort out your assets, either tangible or intangible. And that leads to something that Andrew said, which is a long, what's it?
A life that's nasty, brutish, and long.
Yeah, nasty, brutish, and long, yeah.
The opposite of what Keynes
The opposite of
predicted.
Keynes,
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's why we built the diagnostic, really, because it's pretty important to ask yourself, am I depleting, maintaining, or building my assets? And it's sort of surprising. Do the diagnostic, you'll be quite surprised, actually, that you think you're doing enough, and in fact you're not. So yes, there are real risks, and that's why it's so important that we start talking about it now and not go into some sort of la-la land about everyone retiring at 65.
If I can pick up on the risk one too, because I think there's in a very technical sense, there's a lot of risk issues. We think the implications for the financial system of this are huge, because so much of the financial system is set up around a 3-stage life. Pensions is about older people, mortgages is about this stage. You'll have seen recently that some of the high street banks now offering mortgages to up to 80, which I think is interesting. But the 3-stage life has sort of captured the finance world, and even the word pension used to just be the king giving a source of income to anyone, and now it's about being old. But there's a really interesting risk, and one is longevity risk, which we've always struggled with. But there's something quite interesting that's occurred. So forgive me when I talk about statistical distributions, but for most of human history, the median has been below the mean. So the majority of people have lived less than the average. What is happening with longevity is you're seeing the distribution flip the other way, so that more than 50% of people will live above the average. The crudest way of understanding that is, say the average life expectancy does reach 100, subject to debate. A lot of people feel there's a natural limit at 120. The oldest person ever to have lived is 122. So let's take 120 odd as a limit. If the average is 100, there still will sadly be people passing away at 20 or 30. But for every one person passing away at 20, if the average is 100, you need 4 at 120. So for most of life, the risk has been you live healthier for longer than the average. I think we've now got the opposite risk, which is that you're going to be ill with Alzheimer's or disease early. And that's a risk. The expectation is more life and more healthy life. But of course, if you then, as we get that metaphor of pacing the race over 15,000 meters, not 10,000 meters, if you start work later and you start a family later, but then get incapacitated early, the impact on your lifetime welfare is going to be huge. So it's a very different set of risk, I think, we face now. One of early disability, and that's a risk rather than the average outcome, but one I think is a really challenging one.
Interesting. Lynda, you mentioned they're age agnostic. I was like learning new terms. I love that term. Can you talk us through a bit more the quality of work implications from this longevity?
Yeah, well, Well, the most obvious one is, what's actually, there's so many implications for work. It's sort of really fascinating. And we touch on it in the book, but we're writing more about that. So do please follow what we're writing, because you'll see we've got some articles coming out in MIT Sloan and HBR about which sort of follow the debate. So we're still very much, in the middle of the debate. So what it means for work, well, you can just imagine it yourself, really. You're going to have to encourage people to work longer and provide opportunities for them to do so, and not be so, odd about people at the age of, I speak as a 61-year-old, obviously, so, that you have to retire at that age. It's just completely, so there's that. There's a question, of people moving in and out of the labour market, so the multi-stage, some of it is you move out of large corporations, you become an independent producer, you do some transitional stuff, you explore, well, you want to get back in again. And at the moment, the only way that organisations have a narrative about people moving in is mothers moving back in once they've had children. They do that so badly. They've got to really learn how to do that. They've got to, quite often, organisations use age as a way of thinking about stage. As they say, oh, you're 55, therefore you must be there, or you're 40, so you must be there. So once that goes, then they have to start thinking about you as a person, and not as an age group, not as a demographic, which is why, by the way, in the book, we haven't really gone mad about generational differences, because I think that sort of adds to the stereotyping, in fact. I think what you're going to find is you have to look at people as individuals, and organizations, large companies, find that extremely difficult, because there's just too many, and it's much easier just to say, you're a 55-year-old woman, so you must be like this, when actually you're not going to be like that. So that's why I think we've both sort of said that. There's going to be quite a fight, actually, about people wanting to experiment and be individual, and organisations saying, we'd like you all to be the same, because it's easier for us.
Andrew, I know you, in the book, you don't focus too much on what governments can do, but perhaps a word here about productivity, entrepreneurship. What does that mean in terms of how governments should at least think about these issues?
Yeah, the role of government's clearly going to be a big one. And governments are kind of weird on these issues because, naturally governments are short-termist around elections, but they're often very long-term in terms of, thinking 60, 70 years out. So I think there's some hope that governments will do something here, and they're already moving into anti-ageist legislation. One of the problems is dealing with the fact that previous milestones of being 18 or being 65 will no longer have the same significance. And then the other problem is this diversity of choice that people will make. You can sequence a multi-stage life in many different ways. So I think you're going to start to see governments moving more and more, as I think you're already seeing in the pension world, to the concept of lifetime allowances rather than age-specific allowances. Give people the choice to sort of allocate across their life how they want to do certain things. They're also going to have to start backing, I think, so Lynda was talking about the battle with HR. One of the things I really enjoyed working on this book was reading about the social history of leisure and seeing how the mass labour movement and the trade unions started to try and protect the workforce to make sure they had a concept of leisure and family and social life that fitted for them. And I think we're going to see a huge political fight as we try and get firms to give us the same flexibility that we need now to construct these different retirement age, these different portfolios. So I think that's going to be a huge area going forward that governments are going to have to deal with, creating more flexible, support for more flexible working arrangements. By the way, this has huge implications for gender issues because most of this additional life is coming after the years of childbirth, which evolutionary is a kind of weird result. But it does, if more of life is about life after having children, that does seem to be quite fundamental for the implications for gender equality.
Okay, so in the last few minutes, before we open it up for questions from the audience, Lynda and Andrew, I want you to help us peer into this future. If you were to describe this future, one vision of this future, I know there's multiple versions of this, are we going to work fewer hours in a week? Will we have more leisure time that we can command ourselves? Will we be able to change that horrible, horrible graph that Andrew showed us about life satisfaction decreasing from the age of 25 until finally you hit a nadir at age 50, for it to slowly improve and then to drop off again at around 65. You know, are we going to just be able to toss that out the window? Lynda.
That's such a difficult question, Lynda. It really is. I think it's so difficult to know how it's going to play out. So here's some predictions. One is you're just going to see a great deal more variety in terms of the way people live their lives. And I think you're going to see sort of variety and diversity. There is a big debate about the winners and the losers, and that's a debate that's happening in terms of technology as well as anything else. You know, the hollowing out of work is bringing the winners into a very clear position. And there is a winner-loser narrative here as well, actually, that you could describe if you wanted to. So I think that it's hard to know to what extent organizations will, for example, bring in flexibility. I've been studying companies and writing about HR in organizations for 25 years, and I've been really surprised at how slow things have changed. And really, most of the interesting experimental stuff with HR is done in small companies. It's not done in large. So I think you'll see small companies, you know, trying to find ways of fitting in with people's new lives. But I think large companies will hold on as long as they can, just as they've done with flexible working. And so you will see small companies, well, there are already small companies where you say, you know, you just work 4 days a week, and then you take a month off. And there are software companies that are already doing that. But Unilever isn't, you know, British Telecom isn't. So it would be foolish for me to say, I think it's all going to change overnight, because I just don't see any evidence of that. But you are going to get more and more resistance. And that's always good, because that changes things.
Andrew.
Gosh, yes. So echoing what Lynda said, we think a lot more variety. A 3-stage life, a 70-year life in lockstep has a uniformity about it that will be massively challenged and is already being challenged. The other reason you'll see variety is we don't know what works. We are about to embark on a massive social experiment because we don't know what works. Some people will do the wrong thing that later on will be seen as a failed model. As well as social history of leisure, I read about the history of teenagers. For most of human life, there's been children and adults. It took about 80 years for society to nail what teenagers were and what they should do during that time.
How you could sell to them.
No, I mean, you know, their first response
what they would buy.
The first response was the Boy Scouts, and the end one was Jimmy Dean. So there's sort of there was a lot of experimentation along the way. So that will add to the variety as people make experiments. Your very interesting question about time and leisure, I think, is a good one. You know, if productivity continues to rise, and that's a subject for another day perhaps, we will, I think, see people working fewer hours, so the week will be structured differently. We talk about transitions and change. Sometimes you're going to have a job which is 24/7, it's just about building up your finances. Other times you'll want a job that's got a better work-life balance. And sometimes in between, you'll want to have time where you can reinvest in your skills and take an online course or come to London Business School, or whatever it might be. And I think, you know, what you're therefore going to see is some people wanting to work much shorter working weeks and much more flexibility, and firms having to offer that as well as the more standard sort of 24/7 life that we know. Some firms where human capital is really important will give in to the demands of the workers. Other firms where human capital is less important will say, this is it, this is what you get, no diversity. That's another aspect of the inequality that worries me. But I do think as a consequence of this, if we're going to have within the firm some people working sort of 24/7, others 3 days, others 5 days, some mornings, some evenings, some days, we will have to redesign the nature of work so that we can allow for that sort of flexibility and substitutability, so that it's not that everyone's around all the time or else things don't work. And that may involve technology, it may be redesigned, but I think that's going to be a really interesting part of this process.
I'm going to open it up to questions, but I'm going to do something that I know I'm a little bit known for, which is I like to do a final lightning round. It's kind of like when you're in the pub and you do this game where you say the first thing that comes to your head. You know, boxers or briefs, but not boxers or briefs. But if there was one change you think people in this audience should leave with, based on your research, what would it be? I'll go first.
Yep.
I need to save 17% of my income
Yeah.
to retire on.
Yeah.
Lynda.
I think self-awareness. You really understand who you are and what it is you want. Yeah.
Andrew.
Yeah, plan for longer than you probably thought.
Lovely. Okay, we are now open for questions from all of you. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There will be a microphone that's coming around. And I've also been asked to ask you to stand up so you can be properly captured on film.
For all time.
Question in the back, the lady there.
I'm really interested in this idea of transformation as a key skill for people as they move between stages. What resources do you think are going to help people transform? You know, is that going to come back to employers? Are we going to see growth in business schools? Where are the growths going to come to support that?
Growth in business schools, obviously.
Yeah,
but,
obviously. Especially the ones based in London.
Yes, like this one.
in Regent's Park specifically. Well, actually, that's a really important question, and it's a question that both corporations and governments are thinking about at the moment. My advice, I was asked by the government to talk about this, and this is my advice to them, so I'll give it to you. It's about networks. So if you have networks which are incredibly similar to you, it's very difficult for you to transform. So what could the government do to help people to transform? They could help people connect to people who are very different. And one of the ways that they're thinking of doing that is to build platforms that allow people to connect to people doing the sort of jobs that they would like to do and show them the career. So what you're going to see, certainly the UK government beginning to roll out, it'll take a few more years, is they are going to start rolling out a really deep understanding of not career paths, but how people get their way through jobs. And the more information you can give people about what people doing the sort of things that you would like to do, how do they get there, what do they talk about, how do they live their life? The more you understand that and the more you're connected to them, the more likely you are to be able to create transformation. So I do think that helping people understand about what diverse networks means. For example, right now, and the major work on networks has been done in the Midwest of the States. So this is the reason why I'm saying this. If you look at middle-aged men in the studies that have been done, and Judy, you know this better than I, of people in the Midwest, 80% of the friends and networks of middle-aged men are people within a 5-year age group band of them doing very similar work, and also men. Well, those men are going to find it very difficult to transform themselves, where everywhere they look, people are just like them. So actually, the simplest way is to create more diverse networks, and that's what I would encourage both governments and corporations to think about.
Yeah. And these transitions, sometimes you'll be a choice. I'm bored with this career, or I'm bored with this job, or I just need a new challenge. Sometimes they'll be forced upon you. My skills are no longer relevant because a robot's taken my job or my industry's disappeared. So dealing with both those type of transitions will be important. I think the challenge is that if the transition is a change, the company's not really going to support you because you're going to go somewhere else or do something different. So that it will be governments and society. I think it will be a social network issue. So feeding on what Lynda said. But we talk a lot in the book that with the Industrial Revolution, leisure became about recreation. I'm just going to rest and recuperate. We think leisure is now going to be much more about recreation. Yeah. So it's more about investing in time to learn new skills, develop new ideas, and build new networks. So I think just as the Industrial Revolution saw a huge growth of the commercial leisure industry, the football clubs, the music hall, the cinema, we're going to see something similar. It could be a gym, it could be online courses, but we'll start to see a big growth, as you're already seeing, of course, in the coaching world and the business school world as well.
Interesting. Lots of questions. We'll take the gentleman there in the middle.
Role models. Are there any good role models? Where will role models come from? Will we be able to see the evolution of role models to help us?
Yeah, good question.
Well, each stage of our society writes a lot and talks a lot about what the role model, how you do this. So if you look at your library of books, you'll find that at a certain stage, people started buying a lot of books about, what to do with the under fives, and then, how to deal with teenagers. And I think you're going to see a lot more books like ours and more role models around how I did it. And that's one of the reasons why in our website, we've asked people to describe their lives. And quite a lot of people have already done that. And they are telling us how I did it. So I think you're going to find more narratives around how I did it. Now, it's not going to be that says, this is how I do it, and everyone's got to do it. What they'll do in a sort of universe of possible selves is that they will locate themselves in the universe of possible selves that we each have. And just for me, just reading some of the stories, you think, God, that's incredible. What an amazing role model. And so I think you will see more and more role models emerging. And it's going to be a very important part of each individual's journey that there are arrayed around them descriptions, narratives of what they could become. And that's best located with an individual. That's why in the book, rather than talking just theoretically or academically about these possibilities, we actually created people, Jack, Jimmy, and Jane, because people find it much easier to understand something when they can picture it as a person. So I think, we would love more people to describe what they're doing, and that's part of what we want this continuing conversation to be. If you are doing something that's interesting, or if you've faced a transformation, at any age, please go to the website and put your story in. There's already quite a lot there. And at some stage, we'll do something with that. I don't know what.
And the role models is obviously really important. But I think it's worthwhile distinguishing. We talk about a three-stage life, but of course that was a stereotype. There's always people who had different types of life. And so there'll be many people who, are 90 or 100, had a multi-stage life who we would turn to more and more for advice. I think the hardest group is for the younger group, because no one has been born expecting to live to 105. Yeah. So they are absolutely having to start from scratch and just invent it themselves. So they won't have role models. I think they have really influential peers who are having a style of life that people say, that looks good. I think that's what I want to try and do. Yeah. But they won't have the role models because they are doing something absolutely new.
But there will be some. There will be some role models. I went to a wonderful supper a few weeks ago that somebody asked, and it was just women. And they went from age, there was just 9 women around the table. The youngest was 24, the oldest was 72. And actually it was a completely non-ageist conversation. It wasn't, if you had taped it, you would not know what the age of the group was, specifically any individual. And I think that's going to be more important. And I do think moving this thing about age agnostic and letting the generations do things together is going to be very, very important for those sorts of points about role models, yeah.
And by the way, as Lynda would tell you, it's her territory more than mine, but women have had far more experience of multi-stage life and transitions than men. Yeah. So the role models may be more in that area.
There's Judy. I know Judy's sort of out of touch here, out of kilter, but Judy is Professor of Sociology at the London School of Economics. Thank you for being here.
All incredibly interesting, but it's just a segue, perfect segue for me. I just wondered about the implications for gender equality, because you're implying actually rather positively that because of these longer lives there would be more gender equality. And yet when you talked about the creation of notions of leisure and the distinction between work and leisure, there wasn't, and I'm sure you do talk about this in the book, there wasn't very much said about lots of forms of labour that women do for free, voluntary labour, caring labour, those sorts of labour. And I just wondered how that fitted in, given these frightening figures about the amount of money one has to save. So, one would have hoped in this redefinition of what we do with our time, we did a lot more voluntary labour of whatever sort it is. But how does that sort of fit with this picture as well of having to sort of save more? That's what I wondered about.
Well, you know the data better than I do, actually, Judy, because you do time series data on leisure. So just so you know that before we answer it, she's an expert on this. So what we know is that people are converting their discretionary time from community-based work into paid work. And that's true for women and it's true for men. So we sort of skirt around that a bit in the book. But it's clear, and you know better than I, that the amount of time that people do unpaid work in the community has gone right down. And interestingly, and I don't know if you told me this, but somebody told me this, that the research also shows that if people haven't built any experience of doing community-based work when they're when they're younger, they don't suddenly start. So the idea was, when you're 65 or 70, you suddenly start doing community work. You don't. It's a habit that's built when you're younger, which is why what we do at LBS is so important, actually. We build that habit at LBS. We encourage our students to do that. So I think it's very, very worrying because so many people, both men and women, are converting their time, discretionary time, into money. That's why, the higher your income, the less leisure you have, which, of course, everyone was completely surprised at that. Surely, if you've got more money, you take more leisure. Well, you don't. The people in this room who have high incomes have less leisure than people with low incomes. And that was absolutely astounding. And that's because they're converting their discretionary time into money. I don't know, what do you think about that?
Well, I just want to pick up on the question. I'd be very curious to know your answer to that as well. But your question about the gender one. So let me let in a little secret. We are, as you'll noticed in the book, incredibly Pollyannish or Panglossian, if you like, about this world, because we really want to have some positive ideas about longevity so we can start to engage in an excited way rather than focus on the negatives. And things can go lots of different ways, and no one knows the answer, let alone certainly not me or Lynda. On gender, I think what I try and say is that this surely has major implications when so many of the extra years are after childbirth. And I think there's sort of different ways of interpreting that. One is we think in a multi-stage life, both genders will now be more interested in flexible working place practices, and so there's been more people supporting it. There'll also be, because of the end of lockstep, many more breaks in people's employment record and many more shifts and changes. And so the sort of what economists call the asymmetric information, the stigma of periods out of the labour market will disappear, or not disappear, will lessen, and that will also be helpful. That's the positives. You're quite right, as you know better than anyone else in the room, females tend to do a lot of the sort of unpaid work outside of work and within the home. And one of the issues we haven't touched on is the 4-generation household. When people are living for longer and the years of childbirth don't change, you're now going to see it, Jimmy, there was a picture of him as a sandwich generation. We say, well, actually, you're now going to get the club sandwich generation. You've got 4 different generations. And society has to work out who's responsible for what. The grandchildren look after the kids, or do they look after the great-grandparents? And the danger is, of course, that women will end up now having more time because now they can look after 4 generations. And actually, that will eat into their time. The only thing that's interesting, if you look in the States, and I'm sure, again, I know that you know this, certainly in the lower income households, what you're finding is men kind of drop out the labour market in their 40s, and it's women who are then earning money going further. Yeah. But that is more at the lower end. But
no, I agree. I mean, I didn't have I just add, I obviously don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to it. I'm quite struck by the fact that suddenly there's a renewed conversation about a basic income, both from Silicon Valley and from the Royal Society of Arts recently put out. Yeah. I'm rather ambivalent about that. That would take a long time to spell out. Yeah. I mean, if you've got any, I'd be curious if you have a view about that.
You did think about that in the book, didn't you?
Because it was discussed at Davos as well, I remember.
It was.
So we suggest you might have a lifetime allowance, basic wealth, if you like, or basic time off work, which you can then allocate at different points in time. But I would like you. I can't see a level of basic income that's sufficient and affordable. So I think you will have to allocate it to certain groups or certain periods of life. So that might be a different way of doing it.
Got a few hands up, so if I could just pick up a few questions and then allow the panel to answer. So right there, the lady there, and then the lady there.
Hi. My question, I think you alluded to it, Andrew, is about Jane. So we've talked a lot about how people prepare for a longer life. Actually, how do we as employees or corporations help Jane, who's going to support ageing parents, and whether we like it or not, Jimmy and Jack won't prepare, so they will have a shortfall in income, and we will end up with millennials in our corporations having to support parents being called out to help someone who has Alzheimer's. Will we end up having parents' clubs instead of kids' clubs, for example? What are your views on this?
Well, you know this very worrying statistic that Japan now sells more adult diapers than children's diapers, which is your point about adult care. You know, that will, you know, with 4 generations and you know, people are fitter for longer, that won't be the expected outcome, but there'll be so many different outcomes that absolutely lots of millennials will find themselves in that situation. And I do, you know, it's going to be a genuinely interesting question: who looks after whom in this 4-generation household?
And you know, if you say that one marriage won't last the whole time, then who looks after all the stepchildren? You know, what commitments do you have to a family that you've only married into or only become a partner to in your 60s, let's say? So it's a very complex story, in fact. Anthony Giddens talked about this, didn't he, in the whole question of modernity. And in fact, we've used his thinking quite a lot on this, because, you know, just the whole way that you're seeing a recasting of commitments both within a family and in the extended family. Yeah.
Lady here. Okay. And then final question to you, the lady in the front. Sorry, the mic is coming around.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Sorry,
I'm sorry to ask another question about women, and it is related to what you've just been saying, but I wonder about the biological imperative, because you're talking about all this fluidity and flexibility, but for women, the years when they have to decide to have children and relationships are going to give them much less choice than the men. And I just wonder what your thoughts are about that.
I mean, absolutely. And, you know, that's one of our observations, is that life has extended, but the time in which women can have children really hasn't moved that much. Now, of course, I know it does a bit, but it really hasn't. And so I agree with you that it's a real imperative. And, I mean, I don't know what that means, but your observation is absolutely correct, and that makes it a very different issue for men and women. And we see that, by the way, in our MBA students. When we have the Women in Business, in fact, I know some of you have been to it, the Women in Business Day, I'm always surprised at how many, if I'm there, how many women say to me, well, how old were you when you had children? And, you know, did you get married, and did you get divorced, and did you have a full-time carer? You probably have the same questions, Lynda. Yeah. And you're thinking, well, why are you asking me all these questions? Well, because they really want to know. That's why they're asking, because nobody quite knows how they're going to make it all work. So I totally agree with you.
Your graphic, you crossed out marriage early on and put it right before you retire.
Well, I mean, no, that's the point I wanted to try and make, actually. I mean, I think, you know...
No, that means, no, you did get married.
Oh, I see. Oh, okay.
But I want to pick up on that, because I think, you know, our book tries to raise lots of questions, and it tries to suggest some answers, but I think that's one of the hardest questions of all that we struggle with. And you know, it's almost hard to speculate what the answers could be. So this is part of the experiment. But, you know, again, I don't want to come in too much as an economist with sort of structural determinism. But, you know, as economists, we sort of think everything can change, how we structure time, how we structure marriage. And, you know, marriage has evolved over time considerably. And we do say we're going to see a lot of diversity. And the idea of a marriage, or for a lifetime, may come under threat. But the idea that a marriage combines raising a family, becoming financially independent, and meeting your soulmate, you could separate all 3 of those things. Yeah. And so if you have got fit grandparents with more time on their hands, Jane could have a child at 18, raise it with the grandparents, have an independent existence, then when the children are older, earn lots of money, become financially dependent, and then in her 50s and 60s say, now is the time for marriage. I'm not saying that will happen, I'm not saying it's the only thing, I'm not saying it's the best model, but I think you will see increasing diversity here.
Lovely. We'll take both questions together, and then we'll draw this to a close. Please.
It seems to me that one of the interesting things you mentioned was, first of all, that people who are very rich or earning a high income are not giving themselves much leisure time. At the same time, they're clearly investing in their intellectual capital. The people at the lower end of the spectrum who say are dropping off, like 40-year-old men in the States, we won't even mention that that's one of the drivers of the current issues in politics. It seems to me that we've got, no, seriously, we've got, I think we have a major transitional issue. I'm very optimistic, and of course I'm going to live to 100 or 120, and I'm working very hard on doing it by staying fit and investing in my intellectual capital. But it means that it's people like us, the winners, I'm sure is defined in your book, that have the capacity both to invest in their vitality and invest in their ability to transform. But what about all the other people? It's going to be very difficult for them. And if you don't invest in your vitality and you're in a service industry, you may not be able to deliver anymore. And I think that's, for me, the question is what's going to happen in the transition. I have no trouble understanding that my kids can do it, and they'll do it through social networks, not through the government.
Thank you. We'll just pick up a question there, and then I'll let you guys answer, and then any final thoughts.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Hi, if there's time for this.
Could you stand up, please?
Sure, sorry. Self-knowledge was particularly important to developing transformational assets. What sources of self-knowledge do you think will develop over time to address this need in society?
Buy their book, firstly.
Can I just
Lynda.
take Peggy's question
Of course,
first?
yes.
Peggy, all that the data show is that people on high incomes work long hours. There isn't any evidence that they're developing any of their vitality or any of their other assets. They may, in fact, if there's probably evidence that they're depleting it actually. So there isn't, we don't know that, but that's not what the research shows.
I think they're the ones who are taking out gym memberships and getting personal trainers. And
Not necessarily, no. Well, Judy will know this better than I. The sociology data just shows that they work very long hours. So we don't know. I mean, of course, we can look at our friends and say they're all doing it, but there isn't evidence of that. There's no evidence, at least none that I'm aware of. So I think it's quite a complicated story. In fact, if anything, you could say people on very high incomes who are working very long hours are depleting a lot of their other assets, their vitality assets and their relational assets. Yeah. So there isn't any evidence that then, yeah.
Andrew, do you want to take the self-knowledge?
Well, if I can take both, if that's okay,
course,
that's all right, because the inequality one's I think, Peggy, you very eloquently said exactly what is a major problem. We haven't written a social policy book, and we were very mindful we haven't. And we said we try to be resolutely positive to create a good debate. If you think about the challenges that those on lower income with lower skills and lower resources face, this could be a life that is nasty, brutish, and long, and that seems unconscionable in a democratic age. The 20th century saw this wonderful invention of retirement, which gave people the last years of their life financially independent, living their own with leisure. If we keep increasing the retirement age, but it's only the rich who are living for longer, we go back to the world where people in the lower skilled jobs see their wage diminish and they keep on working and they have to live at home with their kids because they can't afford independent existence. And that would be to lose one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. So this is a really, really big social policy problem. Our view, or my view at least, and I'm sure Lynda agrees with this, is that we're talking about how society experiments, but you again can't just let one group experiment and get the benefits. How do we tackle it? But the question is, what we know this group can do it, what does government need to do? But that suggests we need to know the answer about the first group before we can say about the second. And again, I go back to the point we made at the beginning. Currently, a 100-year life is not an option for the bottom 10% of the population. So that needs to be tackled. On the self-knowledge one, I'm not sure that this is really my area. One of the things that really struck me as interesting, I think this links into the millennials. My dad sadly is no longer with us, but he worked from the age of 14 to 65 in the newspaper industry. And he turned up at 14, and he was with another boy, and they were both going to be mail boys, and one was put into the sports department, one was put into the mail order department. That was my dad's career for 50 years in mail order and advertising. And kind of when he retired, people said, "What did you do?" He said, "I worked in newspapers." But in this multi-stage life where you go through many transitions, there has to be something other than, "Oh, I did this, and then I did that, and I did this." there has to be a thread that defines it and makes it yours. I think that's about the self-knowledge and the identity. It gets kind of Buddhist-like in some way, this story. But I think that's also where you see, you know, the well-resourced young who are postponing things, and they're kind of investing in finding out who they are, what they like, and what they're good at. And I think that's that sort of finding out that self-knowledge. And you talked about explorers, but I think we're seeing a lot in that. So it's a very different form of behaviour. Again, going back to my parents' generation, you know, my father left school at 14, was in a war at 17, married at 19, a house at 20, and a kid at 21. My goodness, that's commitment compared to the options that we see. But I'm not sure that's about identity. So I think that's the thing about self-knowledge.
Lovely. We're out of time. To me, it's always a mark of a great event when we could just go on, but there will be a chance to, because we'll have a networking reception in S1 right after this. I'm supposed to give closing remarks, but I'm not going to. In fact, I'm going to ask you to do it. Please show a show of hands if you think that you are persuaded that 100-year life is going to happen and that you are going to make some changes in your own life as a result. Show of hands.
Oh, wow.
To me, that is the best closing
That's
there could
fantastic.
be.
That's good.
You know, as the saying goes, there's nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come.
Yeah.
And I certainly feel like this has been a terrific moment. So please join me in thanking not just Lynda and Andrew, but also the Dean, Andrew, for hosting this event, and Mamuna and the terrific team for allowing us to be here and hear these wonderful thoughts and share this moment. And as soon as you start clapping, you won't hear me, so I'll say again, S1 drinks. And there'll be book signings as well then, so please join me in thanking you.